It's my great pleasure to introduce Stephen Wolfram. So Stephen is a rare blend of physicist, computer scientist, and entrepreneur. He's the creator of Mathematica and Wolfram Alpha, the computational engine behind countless scientific engineering breakthroughs, and his work on a new kind of science and cellular automata reshaped how we think about complexity, and continues to push forward on the frontier of computation, physics, and AI. So please join me in welcoming Stephen Wolfram.
Okay, well, maybe I'm a token example of somebody who's tried to navigate the world of science in a perhaps somewhat unusual way. So I've been lucky enough to make a number of, I think, somewhat interesting discoveries in foundational science over the course of many years. I've kind of alternated between doing basic science and doing technology development so far about 5 times in my life. The basic pattern has been do technology development, build tools that allow one to do basic science, figure out from basic science new ideas, which then turn into tools that can be used to iterate that process. And maybe it'd be interesting to tell my little bit of my life story, because I think it maybe has some lessons for how innovative science might or might not happen in the world. So I grew up in England. I was an enthusiast of space and things like that, and got interested in physics when I was about 10 or 11 years old, started reading physics textbooks, got to the point where I could do things in physics. When I was about 12 years old, I got exposed to computers. That time, a computer was a thing the size of a large desk. And I recently discovered that the computer that I used was the sole product of a big government effort in the early 1960s in England to bring computers to schools. And that whole effort turned out to produce one computer, and that one computer ended up at the school that I was at, and I was kind of its lead user. So sort of interesting to see how that works out. But I kind of started when I was about 14 years old doing kind of physics research kinds of things, and realized, I can figure out stuff that maybe, I wasn't that interested in doing exercises in books. I was more interested in doing things that felt more egotistically satisfying, of things that hadn't been figured out before. And I had sort of a slightly secret weapon, which is using computers to do that kind of science. And so I think I published my first paper when I was 15 years old. I realized you can send a paper into a journal and they don't know whether you're 15 years old or anything else. And my first paper wasn't particularly good, but they got better soon thereafter. But I had started using this kind of secret weapon of using computers as a tool to do science. I was, in retrospect, very surprised that other people hadn't figured out that you could do that. It was a very rare thing for theoretical scientists to use computers, particularly themselves, not delegate it to programmers and so on, and then not to be able to discover sort of frontier things. I guess that I sort of went through the academic system pretty fast and got my PhD when I turned 20 from Caltech in theoretical physics. And then I was on the faculty at Caltech, then I was in sort of tool development phase and developed a big software system, which I then was like, what am I going to do with the software system? I'm just a young professor type. And so that ended up being a big mess of intellectual property wars, which caused me to quit Caltech, which otherwise I'd probably still be a physics professor at Caltech. But I didn't. I ended up starting my first company. This was 1981. I was 21 years old or so. I made many mistakes in my first company. It was a venture capital funded thing. It eventually went public in a very undistinguished IPO many years later. But that kind of was my first kind of major departure from doing the sort of standard academic thing. I think actually one thing that's perhaps interesting about that, in the middle of that whole thing, well, 2 things. I got one of these MacArthur Fellowship things in the sort of first batch of MacArthur Fellow programs, which was kind of interesting in terms of the dynamics of the world. As it happened, it's sort of relevant. The MacArthur Foundation has become much more conservative. They don't give these things to young people anymore. In my case, was it useful? Yeah, somewhat. Not that useful, because I was already, I was a successful, young, hot academic type thing. I was already getting, kind of the job offers, the whatever else, the funding and so on. It was a nice to have, but it wasn't critical. which is a shame to have to say, because it's a, it was a good program, good initiative, but I will not say it was critical in my case. Actually, it ended up after I should say in physics, sort of a relevant thing. In the late 1970s was kind of a golden age for the development of particle physics and the sort of interactions with cosmology and so on. I was lucky enough to sort of be part of that golden age. And I think it's a general feature of what happens in science that, some methodology gets developed. In that case, it was the success of quantum field theory. And given that methodology, there is then a period of maybe 5, 10, 20 years when there is low-hanging fruit to be picked on the basis of that methodology. And lots of cool stuff happens during that time. And if you're lucky enough to be involved, like the stuff I did when I was 17 years old is still sort of relevant canon in particle physics today, because I happened to be involved in this field when it was in this period of rapid expansion. Typically, what then happens to fields is they get successful, they get big. People forget that there were ever foundational questions in these fields. They just say, oh yes, well, it has to be that way because that's the way people have thought it was for 50 years. There's then 100 years of kind of slow incremental growth with lots and lots of people working in that field. And then maybe something happens again that introduces new methodology and sort of gets the whole thing going again. But it's from, during this period of rapid growth, the thing isn't a very well-defined field often. It's quite entrepreneurial. Maybe it has a new name. Maybe the people who are doing it are kind of scrappy. But that's the period when the things which will be most important end up getting developed, typically. In any case, in my own case, actually, right when I had this whole intellectual property meltdown that caused me to leave Caltech, during that time, I was like, I've been doing all this particle physics stuff and developing technology and so on. I'm just going to do something fun. That ended up being probably the most interesting science I've ever done, was sort of building up what became complexity theory and complex systems research and so on, was the result of the fact that I'm like, I'm not going to do this stuff that I was supposed to do. I'm going to do something else. So in any case, in fact, that area of science, I went from Caltech, I went to the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, which had the interesting feature that as its director, its chairman of its board pointed out to me, they'd given away the computer. So there was no way that they could feel good about sort of claiming any intellectual property rights to anything going forward. In any case, I was there for a while and building up this kind of field of complex systems research. To me, it was a very exciting field. There were lots of things to be done. My kind of plan A was convince other people that they should work in this field and, have a collective effort to work on it. I would say that by 1986 or so, I'd kind of was in I'm going to start some institute to work in this field. And so I went around to lots of different universities in the US and said, who will give me the best deal to start this institute here? It was a very interesting kind of study of the different personalities of different universities and what their priorities were and so on. We ended up doing it at University of Illinois, which gave us a great deal and lots of faculty positions and resources and so on. I then realized that rather quickly that this was that starting an institute where you hire good people and you say, just go work on interesting things, was something not very interesting to me. Because while I'm fairly competent at running organizations and things, it was just not, that wasn't what I was interested in. I was interested in doing science and so on. So within actually an embarrassingly small number of weeks, I decided, okay, that plan A is not going to work. I'm going to go to plan B. Plan B is build a company based on the tools that I wanted to have for myself and use that as an environment to be able to do science, intellectual kinds of things that I'm interested in doing. So I started my current company, Wolfram Research, in 1986. I'm still running that company today. Thankfully, that company, I was able to start without any outside investors. And thankfully, we've been profitable every year for the last 38 years or so, which is nice. That's allowed me a considerable degree of freedom to do things that are intellectually interesting to me, at least. And one of the things that's happened, people sort of say, "Oh, you're a scientist. You can't be an entrepreneur running companies, things like that." I've always found the mechanics of running a company fairly easy, But the thing that I've noticed is that the thing you get by running companies is you kind of have to decide on strategy all the time. You have to make decisions, you have to do things strategically. That's a very useful capability when you do science. Because if you look at what ends up being successful in science, it's not the mechanics of how you do things. That is not the main determiner of whether you're going to be very successful. It's, did you pick the right problem to actually go solve? Did you pick the right strategy? And that's something that is incredibly similar to what you end up doing in running companies, for example. So I've found, to me, it sort of adds energy on both sides to be doing kind of the running a company thing and the thing of trying to do sort of strategic science. I mean, our company is not huge, it's about 800 people. So it's big enough that it has internal structure to the point where, hopefully on any given day, there's nothing that pulls in the CEO, so to speak. But although, now that I've said that, today will be a day. But in any case, so I after started the company did very well the first few years. And so then I said, okay, my point here was to build the tools I would need to do the science I wanted to do. I knew perfectly well that those tools would be useful to lots of other people as well. And now, our Mathematica, Wolfram language, and so on have gotten used by, well, basically every major university has a site license for these things, and has gotten used for lots of interesting discoveries and inventions and so on for a long period of time, which is very satisfying. But the thing that, my own personal sort of strategy, I should say, back in the 80s, I was publishing papers in academic journals, all that kind of thing. I noticed one phenomenon, which was whenever I had a paper that was kind of like, I just sort of followed on from things I'd done before, whizzed right through the whole peer review process, was all great. Whenever I had a paper that was seriously original, it had all kinds of problems. So, I adopted the strategy to just be on the editorial board of journals I cared about publishing in, and then I started my own journal in 1986, which I actually haven't published in very much. It's still going today. But in 1986, I had some sort of meltdown with some particular paper and just said, forget it. I'm never going to publish an academic paper again. And I haven't. And the thing that's funny is that people who I know in academia is like, you must have been publishing hundreds of papers. And it's like, no, I have not published a single paper in an academic journal. People have republished things that I've written in academic journals. So there are things of mine that appear in academic journals. But, it's sort of interesting that was not a necessary feature of being able to do and get out pieces of science. So anyway, after the company was rather successful at the beginning, by 1991, I decided to become a remote CEO, which I've been ever since. I guess I was ahead of the curve in being a remote CEO. To start working on on science, and that I thought it would be a one-year project to sort of finish off a bunch of science I wanted to do. Turned out to be a 10-year project. I made this big book called A New Kind of Science, which came out in 2002. I think it's a pretty good book, and it seems to have had, people seem to read it now, which is always nice. But it was interesting what happened when that book came out. So it's a book about kind of a methodology for doing science and using computation as sort of a foundational idea in science. And wasn't going to talk much about science, we can talk about meta-science here, so to speak. But in any case, what happened was sort of interesting because in many fields where people were like, hey, this is really cool, particularly fields in biology, social science, areas like architecture and so on, people were like, this is really cool. My friends in physics hated it. And, even though I was friends with all these people, in this book had 12 chapters. One half of one chapter was about fundamental physics. And they said, we don't need anything new in fundamental physics. We've got string theory. String theory is going to take us all the way. And this is 2002. And it was sort of interesting to see because this was a field where the field had very high self-esteem at that time. And it's like, we don't need anything new. Okay, so that sort of put me off from I was pursuing some things about fundamental physics that I thought were pretty interesting. I thought, the market, which is physicists, doesn't want this. I mean, there were lots of physicists, actually. One notable, well-known Nobel Prize-winning physicist who's now dead was like, please don't do this project of trying to rebuild fundamental physics. Why? He says, because you will overturn what we've been doing for the last 50 years. And it's like, I don't think that's even true. I think the stuff you've been doing is fine. And then he was like, and you won't be able to persuade any, young physicists to work with you on this. And I said, no, we've got tons of physics PhDs working at our company. I don't think that's going to be a problem. It wasn't. But in any case, I decided, the market didn't want that science. So I didn't do it. And instead I worked on what became Wolfram Alpha. That was interesting because Wolfram Alpha came out in 2009. It's something which I suppose in modern terms you would call an AI system. It's something where you ask it questions and gives, computes answers and so on. At the time, people have been trying to build such systems in the AI community for 40 years or so, and it hadn't worked. At the time, so we produced this thing. I remember one AI pioneer, Marvin Minsky, was showing him this thing a couple of weeks before it comes out. And it's like, we built this thing. It's a question answering system. It's like, oh, okay, that's interesting. And starts talking about something else. And it's like, no, Marvin, this time it actually works. And so then he types some things in. It's like, oh my God, it actually works. And it's running around some event that we were at telling people. What was interesting there was the AI field, which was at that time in a very low ebb, things had absolutely not been working, was very receptive. They were very positive. They were very like, oh, this is really cool. It was an interesting difference in the kind of self-esteem of fields between physics in 2002 and sort of AI in 2009. In any case, in my sort of trajectory, for what it's worth, in 2018, I continued thinking about sort of fundamental physics stuff. I made a little bit of a technical breakthrough in 2018, and then some young physicists I should explain another thing. Another piece of the kind of how do you get science done, we built a lot of tooling for doing science with Mathematica and Wolfram Language and Wolfram Alpha. I'd also been interested in kind of how do you actually propagate ideas about sort of thinking foundationally about science, because most of the time people do not think about foundational questions in science. Most of the science that's done is very much, on the incremental edge, and that's how the institutional structure of science is set up. Typically in fields, the people who invent the field know that the foundations are worth looking at. But another, 5 academic generations later, everybody just thinks the foundations are set. You don't have to look at the foundations. Often, the foundations are very undefended, and methods that have come along in the years since those 5 academic generations have been going through will allow one to, have new approaches to the foundations, and you can actually make great progress by looking at the foundations again. But the motivation structure and the kind of institutional structure of science really doesn't lead one to want to do that most of the time. So I've been interested in kind of helping people understand that sort of foundational science is a thing that's worth doing and can be done. And we've been doing a summer school for the last 23 years, kind of getting people from around the world doing those kinds of things. That's worked very well. We've done another program for high school students for the last dozen years, which has worked exceptionally well. So that's been sort of a dynamic that I've had. And actually a couple of people from that summer school, young physicists, were like, you've just got to work on this foundational physics ideas that you've had. So I started doing that in 2019, made incredible progress, and figured out a lot about sort of the foundations of physics. It's kind of neat because about 100 years ago, a lot of progress was made in the foundations of physics. Basically, that was a time when sort of the methodology of formalization and formalized mathematics was really a big thing. And that allowed certain kinds of progress to be made. Progress sort of got stuck for various reasons, actually not only in physics, but also in foundations of mathematics and so on. That foundations of mathematics had sort of the shock of Gödel's theorem, and that led to many things. But now we have kind of a different paradigmatic approach that's sort of based on thinking about things in terms of the foundations of computation. And it's really neat because we have actually been able to sort of unlock these things that were worked on 100 years ago and then got stuck. And actually, I had at first thought that working on the fundamental theory of physics would be a thing that was amusing, fun to do, but utterly irrelevant for any application for at least 200 years. That was my sort of base belief. We made a great deal of progress in foundations of physics, actually right at the beginning of the pandemic. To my great surprise, in the last few years, it's turned out that the methods that we invented for making progress in fundamental physics have actually been applicable, well, first to the foundations of mathematics, which is another very abstract area, but then to things about distributed computing, sort of foundations of machine learning, and to foundations of biology. So this has been sort of a surprise to me, but it's something that I suppose is not that, foundational methodological advances end up being applicable to a bunch of different areas, and that's what's been happening in this case. I would say methodologically, things I've been doing, I view myself as having kind of lived the AI dream for at least 30 or 40 years. Because I see the AI dream as being, you have an idea about what you want to do, and the AI kind of automates getting that done. I've been trying to build tools that make that possible for myself for a very long time. And it works really well. I can be, I think I'm very productive in terms of producing science, and how do I put it out there? Well, I have what I suppose in structurally as a blog, although the things that I write there end up being 100 pages at a pop, so to speak. They have a number of features. One is that they have lots of pictures in them. Every picture you can click it and you get code, Wolfram language code, that you can read if you want to. You can also run it and it produces that picture. So it is sort of built to be reproducible from the beginning. That's turned out to be really valuable because if you look at people who've worked on things, following up things I've done, people who worked at our summer school and so on, they typically start from what the code that I've written, and I've taken a certain amount of trouble to make lovely visualizations and things like this. They can also start from those lovely visualizations. That's really helpful. It's really you can really see very structurally that this idea of kind of sort of computational publishing actually works. Now, our technology happens to be sort of uniquely suited to this because I've spent the last 40 years building this language that allows one to kind of formalize things computationally. It's kind of a notation, just like sort of mathematical notation is a notation for thinking about things mathematically. Our goal is to kind of make a notation for thinking about things computationally. It's a language that is intended not only for computers to read, but also for humans to read and think in terms of. And so it's a place where I've been pushing a lot the idea of computational essays as a way to communicate ideas, where you have a mixture of natural language, English text, some math, some pictures, and some computational language. And the question is the computational language just code, programming language code, that's intended for a computer to digest, or does it, like mathematical notation, sort of carry the content of what you're trying to say? And for the things I've tried to do, it's very powerful to be able to sort of have a computational description of what you're talking about, because not only is it something where people can read it and understand it, but also it's very well defined. It's much more, there is a definite thing that the computer will do if it runs this piece of computational language. That's been useful. Another thing that I've done is a bunch of live streaming. I've live streamed quite a lot of actual doing science kinds of sessions, and we've also live streamed a lot of software development, design review kinds of things. It's an interesting process. I don't know why more people don't do it. I don't know why my friends in academia don't do this. I think that they don't have the, I don't know what it is. I don't really mind if I'm on some live stream and I say something kind of stupid. It doesn't bother me. But maybe that's not the case. I should say, in terms of my own efforts in science, that if I look at the things I've tried to do, it has been very important that developing increasing confidence that it's actually possible to make progress on the foundations of physics or the foundations of biology or whatever, that isn't just a crazy thing to try to do. And I suppose I've been lucky enough that I've kind of had this spiral of increasing confidence that I can actually get things done. I was pretty successful when I was young in a very mainstream area of particle physics. And then, I've had this series of things where I did things that were kind of, out on the edge, and they actually worked out. And that's a very important experience in my observation to have, to make one, be able to be sort of motivated and capable of doing things. I mean, for me, internally, if you look at projects I've done, well, from the outside, they're projects that most people would say that's a very high-risk project. I would say, and it's pretty typical of people like me, I suppose, that from the inside, no project I've ever done has appeared to have any risk at all. I mean, it's always, because, and part of the reason for that is because I know I'm going to get into this project, I have some goal, but maybe that goal will not be achievable, but I'll be able to sort of pivot and get to something else. And that's so far, it's always worked out. I think, let's see, I suppose the one of the things we've done recently, I should have said, back in 1986, I started this research institute. I finally realized a couple of years ago, time to start another research institute, because I'm doing a bunch of basic science. I'd been sort of paying for it out of our company and had a bunch of people working with me at the company. And it really, the motivation of doing science is rather different from the motivation of building technology products. And I sort of realized I need to split this off. So we created our Wolfram Institute. I'm happy to say we got had some funding for it, which is nice. It's not all my money, and that's good. We're starting to hire people, but I'm also trying to think about how do you set up the most effective possible research institute? What does it actually involve? If I look at my company, we've been extremely effective at getting R&D done, but part of the pattern of what's happened is a lot of the new stuff comes from me. I have a lot of extremely capable people who are able to take things which are not necessarily the actual crazy, we don't think this could possibly be possible type thing, but once I've convinced them it's possible, they can go actually do it. I'm still responsible for convincing them that it's possible, but the very new stuff I end up having to drive, the kind of mainstream making progress on R&D, have lots of good people doing that. It's always been an interesting process. When at the company we've done a lot of sort of new initiatives, that's always a challenging thing to do in an existing successful company. My typical strategy is to start a special projects group that does the new thing. I think when we built Wolfram Alpha, I'm slightly embarrassed to say I had a special projects group that involved basically hiding 200 employees working on that project, which was the right thing to do, because by the time that system was demoable, my management team was, the first time they saw it, it's like, yeah, this is really pretty good. If I'd showed it to them 6 months earlier, it would have been, this is a stupid project, it's never going to work. We shouldn't be doing it, and there'd be all kinds of flack associated with it. But in any case, so I've been sort of trying to figure out how do you do kind of the most effective kind of basic science. I think I myself have gotten fairly good at sort of the strategy of science and maybe even the doing of it, because I've built all these tools for doing it. The question is, how do you make an institute that is not just a bunch of sort of very talented people going in random different directions, but how do you make something which, more like what we've done at our company, has some definite flow that can achieve more than the sort of random walk of lots of individual people doing their thing. And I think my current conclusion is that the main thing that we're trying to do is, I'm trying to do a bunch of new stuff. A bunch of people are working with me on that. It tends to be a rather intense experience for them, I suppose, working with me on this new stuff, because I get very, I push very hard to get these things to happen. But then the thing that is sort of the mainstream activity ends up being taking this sort of crazy new methodology and actually connecting it to all the existing sort of academic areas and so on. And that, I think, what one needs for people, you can't tell everybody go off and invent something brilliant every day. It's just not going to work. You have to give people sort of a thing that is the day job that can be done. And I think that this sort of connection to existing academic areas and so on is a good way to have a base for that, and then to be able to go from there as a sort of pool of people to be able to get sort of the pushing for the new things. I suppose I should, just to finish, since we're talking about crypto kinds of things, I've been slightly involved in the crypto world. I guess several blockchains happen to have used science that I've made to do various things with their consensus mechanisms and so on. So I've been a bit involved in that world. And so I have wondered, what can you do that is sort of blockchain meets science? I haven't figured it out. I will say two things. One is, sort of the exercise is, if you're kind of Isaac Newton in 1687, you've invented calculus, you know there's going to be trillions of dollars of value produced, or you're pretty sure there's going to be trillions of dollars of value over the next 300 years. What can you do with that information, right? And the one thing I have thought about, I don't really like this, but it's a reality. Most areas of science have a certain set of know-how that some particular guild of scientists, somebody's students, their grand students, etc., knows about that particular area of science. Often that guild is not monetizable for a long time. Like, for example, with machine learning, it went from basically the early 1980s until 2011 before it was really monetizable. But the people who were involved in the beginning of the 80s, knew a bunch of those people at that time, and in 2011, they were the same people. There was this guild that had sort of been non-monetized, so to speak, and then suddenly it becomes very monetized. So one wonders whether there are ways to kind of fund the guild over some long period of time, knowing that the likelihood is that that will be, the same set of people that will still be doing it. I don't really like this model because, in my own efforts in science, I've often been an ungilded character working in different areas. I'm not a big fan of this model, but I think that's one of the realistic possibilities. I've also happened to have tried to figure out, have a rather specific, which I guess I won't talk about, but a rather specific technical area where it so happens that you can make, I think, sort of a coin-like mechanism for incenting rather specific discoveries in a particular area of science. I don't know if it will work. I need more understanding of kind of economic mechanism design and so on. But it's sort of interesting to try and, it's really based on sort of proof of work type thing where the work you're doing is actually scientifically interesting. Usually the problem with that is that by the time, if you're going to do proof of work, then you have to know that the work is going to work out, or you can't have a proof of work thing operate properly. This is a case where, for all sorts of reasons, we're pretty sure that the overarching science has to work out, even though we don't know the actual answers, and there's value in getting the actual answers, and so you can kind of use that as a mechanism for proof of work. And I should stop there, and I'm happy if there's any chance for questions or comments. I'd be happy for that. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Stephen. We can take a question or two. Yeah, Dario.
Thank you so much. Dario Tarbarelli from Chan Zuckerberg Initiative and BioHub. I'd love to hear your brief outlook on this notion of the computational language of science. So I started, my first steps were with Mathematica, when I started learning about computation. And there's this, like you said, like this magic of the narrative and the underlying computing going hand in hand, which was really compelling to me back then. And then over the course of the last 20 years, we've seen the explosion of open source in computing, right? And basically, virtually every field of science developing these tools that by now have become like the de facto standard, like communities that rely on Python and R libraries for doing the analysis. And now, over the last 2 years, we see these tools being embedded in agent-based architectures and LLMs, where like what you described, having a natural language prompt turn into executable science is becoming a commodity, right? Or having, to some extent, or having these tools orchestrated by an agent is becoming like very common and accessible to many people. So my question to you is like, how do you see this paradigm of like a unified computational language for science to be able to do this analysis? How do you see this evolve in the next 10 years from where you sit?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people, I built a lot of stuff. A lot of people have copied that in open source systems. That's the way it works. Now, the fact is, if you ask, where did the core innovation come from? It did not come from the open source community. It came from folks like me. And this is, unfortunately, this is a complicated dynamic. I mean, I've thought for a long time, are we making a mistake by not building open source software? And the answer, I think, is not if we want to do innovative stuff. I've been quite successful over the last 4 decades in pushing, continued innovation and so on. The incentives for that are, we made a decent business from it, and it's something I want to do. The fact that we continue to do innovation is largely because of my leadership. If our company was bought by a private equity firm, for example, in a week, the innovation would disappear. And the thing that the question of what, in terms of what will happen going forward, many of the things that I invented 40 years ago are, well, some of the things, like the idea of notebooks, okay, was a thing we invented in 1987. 25 years later, this rather trivial idea became very popular in the open source world. There are many other ideas that I invented a long time ago which still have not been understood very well, and which are still very valuable to people who actually, want to sort of do leading edge things. So I think, in my, my goal has been to kind of make the best coherent language for representing the world computationally, and I intend to go on doing that. I think the kind of the LLM world has a very interesting interaction with what we're doing, because if you write Wolfram language code with an LLM, you can read that code. That's not the case writing, R code or Python code or something like this. You get this big blob of code, and maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. The goal for us is to have a language where you can read it as well as have the computer read it. So I think that's, and in terms of, what's the, that's my basic observation is, and I've certainly thought about this a lot. If you look at the dynamics of what's happened in the open source world versus what's happened in the lead world, so to speak, there's not really. For us, most people who use our technology don't pay for it. Most people are at universities where the university paid for it, government labs, companies and so on, where it was centrally bought. And that individual person isn't paying for it any more than they're paying for the computers that they're using. It's part of the sort of infrastructure of what they're doing. So that's but I think I think it is not, the idea that sort of open source is going to innovate has not been the thing that I've seen, and that's not been, that's open source is great. We use tons of open source technology. I like it very much, but it's not the place that you go if you want to actually push the sort of leading edge of what's there, I think.
Adam Draper, avid comic book collector, but also venture capitalist. Thank you very much. This was fantastic. I was wondering, so you were a traditional physics scientist. You were in the system. You were at MIT. Caltech, not MIT. And then at some point, it feels like your relationship with resources changed. Whether it was Wolfram Research's success or, but all of a sudden it wasn't you were constrained by resources. You actually you have the luxury of resources in order to do the innovation. How, I guess, is really the question. And then also, I just have been talking to a lot of scientists who are trying to start companies, and their relationship with resources are still flipped the opposite direction. And if you have any advice for a scientist who might be in this room, in order to sort of think about that.
Well, okay, so I have to say I've been lucky enough that I have rarely been resource constrained. Okay, when I was in academia, I was a successful academic. I, had sort of all the resources I needed. I was doing theoretical science, which doesn't need a lot of resources. I would say in terms of the, scientists doing the entrepreneurial thing, I would say I have 2 comments. One is, build something that you actually want, because, I've been lucky enough that, I use the product that we build every day, and I'm not actually the most prolific reporter of bugs anymore. For a long time I was. But that's one thing. The other thing is that people have a terrible habit of having great analytical skills, in one area, and then somehow the thinking apparatus is not kept switched on in some other area. So, you'll see people who are, they're very talented analytical kinds of people. They start some company and they're like telling me, and I happen to sort of as a hobby advise lots of companies. So they're saying to me, what should I do about this, this, and this? And it's just, well, just think about it. You know how to think in some area of science or whatever else, just think about this. And it's like, oh yeah, okay, I guess I can figure this out. But for some reason, people don't have the idea that you can apply sort of analytical thinking in business areas, and that seems to be one of the problems. I think also there's academia has evolved since I kind of left it, and in terms of its relationship with the commercial world. I don't know, I'm always, by the time there's sort of classes about how to start your company, that things have kind of gone a bit bad. It's not, by the time it's a production line kind of thing, that doesn't really make sense anymore. So, a few thoughts anyway.
Hi, Stephen. Firstly, thank you for existing. You have fundamentally shaped my life, so I appreciate that. I did want to ask, though, so my background is computational physics, but I would consider you, and I think you would consider yourself a very early innovator of what we now call computational physics, and I don't particularly think there is a future where research engineers are not integral into how we think about science and science innovation and all that fun stuff. And what I'm hearing that is kind of concerning is that I agree with you, right? I don't necessarily think that open source scientific software is like the vanguard. But the problem with that is that when we do have organizations like a Wolfram Research, right, where there is this push for research engineering and tooling, not just innovation without tooling, it's often singularly led. And while I think that you've done a great job, you've innovated, unless the longevity folks have the answer to senescence, you're not going to be here forever, or going to be able to lead the charge forever. And that's the same for all of the sort of old guard giants that are still doing a lot of great work in the space. And so one of the questions for me, getting to the point, is what do you see as being the primary initiative that we can take now to make it such that research engineering is more of an integral part of or component of how we sort of proliferate science, whether that's in academia or industry? I think that computational physics specifically has shown that computation x scientific discipline is, like I said, absolutely integral for how we think about innovation, but also how we deploy innovation. But I still don't think that it gets sort of the push that it needs. So.
Yeah, look, academia has, a lot of fields that get taught have been around for hundreds of years. Every so often, some new field manages to push its way into academia. Academia has a certain kinds of things. In any given field, there are certain things that are respected. If you're a mathematician, you have to prove theorems. If you do experimental mathematics, nobody thinks that's a real mathematics. If you're in the biomedical field, unless you've done if you have a theory in a biomedical field, it's like nobody really cares about the theory. It's did you do, the clinical trial, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, different areas have different value systems. It's certainly true that tool building has not tended to be something that is well respected in the value system of academia. It's, although there are people where, people who've been involved in building tools, sometimes when they've had papers published, I have a friend who was for a while the most cited author in science, because he happened to be the first author of the BLAST paper, a chap called Stephen Altschul, who was lucky enough to have a name beginning with A. And, and that was a methodological paper that was sort of a tools type thing that could have vanished without trace, but ended up being something people had to refer to all the time. But I think, perhaps a broader question is, where should innovation happen? Should it be happening at universities? Should it be happening in other kinds of places? I've thought about this quite a bit. There are, for example, computer science is an interesting area which did not exist in universities in a serious way even 40 years ago. And has been a strange thing to be added on to academia, because a lot of what happens in computer science is teaching people programming, which is basically a trade skill. There is some component of theoretical computer science that's sort of a different thing, but it's a very funny sort of add-on to the university system, a rather awkward add-on. I personally think the thing one should be teaching is kind of computational X, how to think computationally about things rather than computer science. Just to say one thing about the support of basic science in general, there's a question of why should the world support basic science? And I think one of the observations is whenever there's a monopoly, that monopoly has a reason to support basic science. I mean, whether it's even for my company, there are areas where we are the main supplier of some particular kind of algorithm or something like that. If we do basic science in that area, we will be the main beneficiaries. When it comes, when AT&T was a big monopoly, lots of things in electronics and telecommunications and so on, if they did basic science in that area, they would be the main beneficiaries. I see the US government in the same position. Insofar as the US has the largest economy in the world, many kinds of things that get done in basic science that will be of economic benefit will mostly come back to the US government as a benefit. But the question is, how should the world support basic science? In areas like biomedicine, most people would think, yeah, we want biomedicine to be successful because we have our own self-interest, at heart. In an area like foundations of physics or something, it's like, why should the world support that? It's not obvious. In the US, that was supported for a long time as a thank you for the Manhattan Project. The Manhattan Project was sort of a big surprise in physics. The whole development of particle physics was a long thank you for the Manhattan Project, which finally came to an end in the 1990s. But so I think it's a challenging question is sort of why should the world support basic science? How should basic science, and then the question is the mechanics of how it should actually get supported. And I think I should end on that difficult to answer question.
One more giant round of applause for Stephen Wolfram, please. Thank you.